They called him crazy for digging an underground tunnel, until the blizzard showed who was right. When the news spread through the township, the reaction was almost unanimous. Laughter. Not the kind of laughter that comes with sympathy, but the kind that carries pity mixed with disbelief. The laughter of those who think the neighbor has lost his grip on reality for good. The matter was simple. He was digging. Digging for real, with a shovel and wood, opening an underground corridor that ran from the back of the house to the supply shed at the end of the property. And when people asked what for, he answered with the same calm as always, for when the snow came and shut everything down. The snow shuts everything down every winter, someone said. We always find a way. But he wasn't talking about just any snowfall. He was talking about the kind of storm the elders of the region spoke of in low voices, the one that comes once in a generation and doesn't ask permission. The problem was that no one wanted to hear elder stories anymore, no one except him. And that was exactly why the joke spread through the whole township. It became talk over the fence, at the general store, at Sunday service. The man who was digging a tunnel nobody asked for a blizzard nobody believed would come, using old wood and the sweat of a body already past 50. They called him crazy, some with affection, others without. But none of them knew yet what was to come. Arthur Miller had grown up in that small township, nestled between mountain peaks, where the winters were harsh and the neighbors still knew one another by their grandparents' names. He was a 56-year-old man, still firm in build, used to heavy labor since he was a boy, with a face marked by the sun and the wind of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He wore the yellow hooded coat almost every day of the cold season, a coat his wife had bought about 3 years before, and which he had adopted as if it were part of himself. He had eyes that would stay on the horizon when he was thinking about something, and in recent months he had been thinking a lot. It had all started with the memory of a conversation he could barely describe properly, because it was one of those you absorb when you're still a child and only understand years later. His father, Mr. Henry, was a man of few words but of great memory, and one of the memories he carried with the most weight was that of the great winter of 1965. Arthur must have been about 10 years old when his father sat with him on a rainy afternoon and told him about the day the snow shut everything down for almost 2 weeks. No power, no food, no way to leave the house. 3 families in the township went through a very difficult situation. One of them lost everything they had stored away because they couldn't reach the supply shed at the back of the property. A man who understands the winter, Mr. Henry would say, never lets the winter catch him by surprise. Arthur had kept that inside him for decades, and when at the beginning of that year the older farmers in the region started saying they could feel a different winter coming in the air, that phrase came back all at once, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to appear. It was on a Monday in March, while having coffee with Martha, his wife, that he first spoke about the project. "I'm thinking about connecting the house to the shed through the underground." Martha lowered her mug slowly. She was 54 years old with short white hair, dark eyes that knew how to read her husband better than any book. And what those eyes saw that morning was a man with an idea that was going to mean a lot of work and little result, at least in her view. Connect how? A tunnel, dug into the ground, with wood on the walls to hold up the structure. There'll be snow, there'll be windstorms, but we go underneath and reach the supplies. The silence that followed was the kind that says more than any argument. Martha had a patience that had been tested for years. Arthur wasn't a bad man, far from it, but he had a tendency to lose himself in projects that consumed dollars, time, and energy, and that rarely went where he planned. 3 years earlier, it had been the hanging garden that turned into 6 months of work, and in the end produced a few heads of lettuce. Before that, the water cistern that stayed half-finished for nearly a year. She didn't say anything about those things that morning, but they were in the living room too, sitting at the table with them. "I'm being serious, Martha." "I know you are, Arthur. I know." And that was exactly the problem. When David, the 30-year-old son who lived a little over a mile away with his wife and 2 small children, heard about the project, he got straight to the point. "Dad, this isn't a project. This is stubbornness with a shovel in your hand." Arthur didn't answer. He went out to the property, measured the distance between the house and the supply shed, 42 yards, and began planning on paper. The only person who didn't laugh was Mrs. Dorothy. Arthur's neighbor for nearly 40 years, she was 83 and had a body that seemed to have shrunk with time, but a mind that stayed sharp as a tack. She lived alone in the wooden house next door, after her husband had left this world a few years earlier, and spent a good part of her days sitting on the porch watching what went on in the street. When she saw Arthur start digging, she watched for a good while. Then she called over the fence. "I know what you're doing, Arthur." He stopped, leaned on his shovel and looked at her. "I think you're the only one around here who knows, Mrs. Dorothy. Your father used to talk about that winter of '65 sometimes, I remember." She paused. "I was there that winter. I was 25. I went 10 days without being able to get to my mother's house. 100 yards away, 100 yards, Arthur." He stayed quiet. "I know. Don't let them talk you into stopping." She said it without any drama, almost like someone commenting on the weather. Then she went back to watching the street. Those words weighed on Arthur in a way he didn't expect, not because he needed permission, but because it was the first time someone confirmed that the fear he carried wasn't invented. It was real. It had a history. It had a first and last name. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out since we're just getting started. Now back to the story. But the township didn't see it that way, Mr. George, the neighbor on the other side, stopped at the fence one afternoon and stood watching Arthur work for a few minutes. "What are you digging for anyway? Going to plant potatoes underground now?" A few people laughed. It was the kind of joke that spread easily in a small township, and Arthur had learned long ago that answering only fed the fire. So he kept working in silence, day after day, as April turned into May, and May turned into June. The work was harder than he had calculated. The soil in the region was mixed, part dirt, part rock, and there were spots where the shovel hit stone and wouldn't go any further. Arthur had to call a friend from another neighborhood to help break through some of the harder stretches, and that cost dollars Martha didn't want to see spent. "Arthur, we have bills to pay." "I know about the bills, Martha. You know? And you keep spending on this project?" The argument wasn't new, but that night it took on a different weight. Martha said things that hung in the air for days afterward. She said she was tired of watching him start things he never finished, that she had been alone in that marriage for a long time, that she didn't know where she was heading anymore. Arthur sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee that was growing cold, without answering. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he knew that sometimes speaking before understanding his own heart only makes everything worse. Martha went to bed. Arthur stayed awake looking at the tunnel plans spread across the table. There are things you hear, and you feel like you know that pain from somewhere. That silence between two people who love each other but can no longer reach each other isn't easy to carry. It isn't easy even to hear. The following weeks were the heaviest of the project. Arthur dug more than 2 hours a day, every day, even with wet feet and aching shoulders. David stopped by the house one afternoon and stood at the edge of the excavation, looking at the hole that was already almost 40 feet long. "Dad, this is going to give you back problems." "My back's been giving me problems for years, son." David was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to give up, are you?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "No." His son let out a deep sigh. "Then at least let me help from time to time." Arthur looked at him. David had his grandfather's eyes, that dark green that showed more when he was serious, and at that moment he was very serious. "You can come early tomorrow," Arthur said simply. They didn't hug, didn't make speeches, but that was the beginning of something the two of them had needed for a long time without quite knowing what it was. Sometimes a father and son need a shovel in hand to find their way back to each other, not words, working side by side. With David helping on the weekends, the work progressed. The wooden frame reinforcing the tunnel walls came from old planks Arthur had stored in a corner of the supply shed, hardwood his father had left behind and that he'd never found the right use for. Now he had. Mrs. Dorothy would show up at the fence from time to time. "It's coming along well, Arthur." "There's still a ways to go, Mrs. Dorothy." "But it's coming along well." She said that with a serene conviction that Arthur needed more than he recognized. The old woman knew what she was seeing because she had lived through what no one else remembered, and while the rest of the township laughed, she stayed by the fence with the watchful eyes of someone who carries within herself a memory the body doesn't forget, even when you try. In early July, when there were about 30 feet left to reach the supply shed, the temperature dropped in a way the older folks said hadn't happened in a long time. Overnight, that damp, heavy cold that seems to have no end. And the forecasts circulating among the residents were worrying. A lot of snow was coming, more than usual. It was around that time that Martha made a decision Arthur didn't expect. She left to spend a week at her sister's house in a town further down, far from the Blue Ridge Mountains. It wasn't a declared separation, there was no big fight. She just packed her bags with a calm that was almost worse than any argument, and said she needed to breathe a little, that she was drained, that she didn't know what she wanted. Arthur stood at the door watching the car disappear around the bend in the road. David found out the same day and came to the house. He found his father at the edge of the excavation working, his yellow coat covered in dirt. "Dad." "I'm fine, David." "I didn't ask if you were fine." Arthur stopped, looked at his son. "She'll come back." "How do you know?" He stood for a moment looking at the end of the tunnel, where a makeshift lantern cast a yellowish light on the wooden walls. "Because she left without saying she's not coming back. She left because she needed air, that I understand." David didn't say anything else. He picked up a shovel and started working beside his father. Over the next 3 days, father and son worked together almost without stopping. The tunnel advanced. The wood was placed with more care than in any previous section, and when there were about 6 feet left to complete the connection to the supply shed, the snow began to fall. At first, slowly, as it always begins, scattered flakes that seem harmless, then denser, heavier, the kind that fills the sidewalks in a matter of hours. And in the early hours of the 7th day after Martha left, the blizzard really hit. The wind that came with it was different. Arthur knew the wind of the Blue Ridge Mountains the way he knew his wife's voice. He could tell when it was just passing through and when it meant business. This one meant business. He stood at the bedroom window for a while, listening to the snow tap against the glass, and made up his mind. He put on his yellow coat, laced up his boots, and headed out. The cold that hit him at the door was enough to stop a thought in its tracks. The snow was already past a foot deep and still coming down without let-up. The porch light barely reached 10 feet ahead. The pine trees around the yard had vanished into the white, their branches bent low under the weight. But Arthur knew the path he needed to take. He made his way to the mouth of the tunnel, about 12 feet from the back door, and started clearing the entrance that the snow had partially covered. It was exactly that image that stayed burned into the minds of those who saw it. A man on his knees in the snow, shovel in hand, yellow coat dusted white, carving a path beneath the storm while the wind howled around him. What he didn't know, at that moment, was that on the other side of the fence something had gone wrong. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now back to it. Mrs. Dorothy had gone to the bedroom window when the wind started to howl, and on her way back she tripped over a folded rug on the floor, fell, and hit her shoulder against the wall. She didn't scream because Mrs. Dorothy was the type to carry things on her own. But there she was on the floor, in pain, unable to get herself up properly, and the snow taking over everything made it impossible for anyone to open the front door from outside. The bedroom light was on, but in the blizzard closing in around her, nobody could see a thing. Arthur was about 20 feet from the mouth of the tunnel when he heard it. It wasn't a loud cry, more of a call muffled by the wind, a voice that barely crossed the space between the two houses. He stood still for a second, trying to figure out where it came from. He looked over at Mrs. Dorothy's house. The light was on in the bedroom. He walked to the fence. He tried to open her gate, but the snow had piled up thick on the other side and the wood was stuck. He ran back, went in through his own back door, headed to the tool room, grabbed the iron bar he used to break rock in the tunnel, and went back to Mrs. Dorothy's gate. 3 firm pushes and the wood gave way. She was in the bedroom, sitting on the floor with the wall behind her, pale but conscious. She looked at him with an expression Arthur never forgot. It wasn't fear. It was relief. "I knew you'd show up," she said. "Mrs. Dorothy, are you all right?" "Shoulders hurting, but I'm in one piece." She paused. "Couldn't get myself up." Arthur helped her slowly, carefully over to the armchair in the bedroom. He checked her shoulder without putting pressure on it, made sure she could move her arm, brought her water from the kitchen. Then he picked up her phone from the nightstand and called David. Her son answered, sounding groggy, but woke up fast. "I'm on my way, Ma, but the main road out front is blocked." "No need to come out now, I'm here with her. But first thing tomorrow morning, you come." Arthur stayed at Mrs. Dorothy's house that night. He warmed up soup from her fridge, kept the heater running, and sat in the living room armchair while she rested. Outside, the blizzard kept coming without end, the wind rattling the windows, the snow covering everything in a white that erased the outlines of the world. Around 3 in the morning, he went out to the back of Mrs. Dorothy's lot. He thought of something he hadn't considered before. Her supply shed was about 100 feet from the house. With winter the way it was, she'd need provisions in the days ahead, and no car was going to make it up there for a while. He went back inside and asked, "I've got what's in the pantry," she said. 3-4 days if we're careful." That was enough for now, but along with it came a clear realization that isolation could last longer, and if it did, she was going to depend on someone being able to reach her supplies somehow. The next morning, when the snow let up for a few hours, David arrived on foot, carrying a backpack with provisions. He saw the entrance to the tunnel his father had cleared during the night, with the lamp still lit inside, the yellow light flickering at the far end of the dark corridor. He stopped, stood there looking for a long while. "Dad, does this reach all the way to the supply shed?" "About 2 meters short." David was quiet for a second, Then, "So what if we finish it now?" They finished it that day. With the ground harder from the cold, it took more effort than any previous stretch. But when David knocked down the last wall of earth separating the corridor from the inside of the supply shed, and the lamplight spilled into both spaces at once, the two of them stood there for a moment without a word. It was more than 40 meters of firm wood, secure walls, compacted floor, a whole corridor running beneath the snow. "My God," David said. Arthur said nothing, but his face said what words didn't need to. In the days that followed, as the blizzard came back with force and sealed everything shut again, the tunnel became the lifeline between the house and the supply shed. And since Mrs. Dorothy's land bordered the supply shed on one side, Arthur improvised a side passage connecting the structure to the shelter of her house as well, covering the distance with leftover wooden planks from the project. She was so surprised when he showed her that she was speechless for almost a minute. Then she said with a voice that trembled just a little, "Your father would have loved to see you today, Arthur." Look, I had to stop before continuing to read that part, because there are certain phrases that land in the right place at the right time, and that was one of them. The blizzard lasted 8 days. 8 days with the main road closed, no way in or out, families having to make do with what they had at home. The township was isolated, and during those days, the mouth of Arthur's tunnel became a landmark. Neighbors who needed supplies went underneath instead of trying to beat the snow on the surface. Children who had heard about the crazy man who dug came to look up close, eyes wide. Mr. George, who had laughed at the potato joke months before, showed up at the mouth of the tunnel on the 5th day with an expression that mixed shame and gratitude, and maybe more shame than gratitude. "Arthur, you got some extra kerosene? My heater's about to run out." Arthur went to the supply shed and came back with what he had. He made no comment about the joke, said nothing about being right. He handed over the kerosene and told him to let him know if he needed more. Mr. George looked at him for a moment. "You're a sensible man, Arthur. I needed to say that." Arthur nodded and left. There were people in the township who never admit they were wrong. Arthur knew that, and he wasn't expecting anyone to admit it. What he had wanted for months had never been approval. It was only that the people he loved wouldn't think he was losing his mind. Martha called on the 6th day of the blizzard. He answered in the middle of the afternoon, his hands still cold from the last trip through the tunnel. Her voice came through the line with a tone he knew, the tone of someone who has processed something and arrived at a different place from where they were. "I'm hearing on the TV what's happening in the Blue Ridge Mountains," she said. "The blizzard is big, Martha, but we're fine." A second of silence. "The tunnel? It's working." More silence. Then, in a lower voice, "When the road opens, I'm coming back." "I know," he said. "I made fresh coffee here." She let out a tiny laugh, almost nothing, but Arthur recognized it as the kind of tiny laugh that means things are going to be all right. Those little laughs that a couple accumulates over 30 years and that are worth more than any word. On the 8th day the wind stopped. The sky cleared in a way that seemed almost unreal after so much grey, and the first rays of sunlight hit the snow and made everything shine as if the Blue Ridge Mountains had put on a brand new outfit. Little by little, the residents came out of their houses, looking at the landscape that had taken on a new face, and greeting each other at the fences with that relief of people who had survived something together. Arthur was at the mouth of the tunnel adjusting one of the planks at the entrance when Mrs. Dorothy appeared beside him, wrapped in a thick wool coat, her arm still in the brace that the doctor who had come with David had put on. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Go ahead, Mrs. Dorothy. Your father dug this tunnel with you, you know, even though he was never here." She looked at the wooden entrance, the lamp still lit inside. "That story he told you when you were a boy, it stayed here all this time." She pointed to his chest. "And when you needed it, it came out." Arthur stared at her for a moment. "You're a wise woman, Mrs. Dorothy." "I'm an old woman," she corrected, with that smile that only appeared when she was being ironic, "who was lucky enough to have a stubborn neighbor next door." They laughed, and it was one of those laughs you don't plan, that come from a deep place where exhaustion and relief mix and come out together. Martha arrived 2 days after the road reopened. She stopped the car, stood staring at the tunnel entrance for a moment, then walked over to Arthur, who was on the porch. There was no speech. She stood in front of him for a second, looked into his eyes and said, "Show me how it works?" He took her hand and led her to the entrance. He lit the lamp inside, and the two of them went through the wooden corridor that smelled of damp earth and pine until they came out the other side into the supply shed, where the shelves Arthur had built over the years held everything the family needed for a long winter. Martha stood looking at the shelves, at the wood fitted into the walls, at the passage that had taken 6 months of work and an amount of stubbornness she knew better than anyone. "You knew," she said, not as an accusation, as recognition. "I didn't know for sure, but my father knew, and I trusted him." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have trusted you." Arthur squeezed her hand. "We learned together, Martha." David arrived that afternoon with his young children, who were fascinated by the tunnel and wanted to run inside. Arthur took the oldest by the hand, a 6-year-old boy named Henry, in honor of his great-grandfather, and the two of them went through the corridor together, the lamp swinging in front. "Grandpa," the boy asked, looking at the wooden walls, "who built this?" "I did. And your great-grandfather helped me, the way he knew how." The boy looked at him with that seriousness that only a 6-year-old has. "How did he help if he's not here anymore?" Arthur thought about the answer for a second. "He told me a story when I was little, and I never forgot it. Sometimes that's what the elders leave us, stories we only understand when we need them." The boy considered that very seriously. "Then I need to pay attention to the stories you tell me." Arthur felt a lump in his throat he hadn't expected. "Yes, son. Pay close attention. In the following months, that Blue Ridge community had a winter different from usual, but in a way no one had predicted. People grew closer to one another. The blizzard had done what years of good intentions had failed to do. It had shown that when the wind closes everything in and the cold tightens its grip, what's left is exactly the people. The stories that were passed down, the stubbornness of a man who believed in what his father had left behind. The tunnel stayed. Arthur made a few adjustments afterward, improved the lighting, and replaced the boards that had grown more fragile under the weight of the snow. Mrs. Dorothy asked that the side passage to her supply shed remain, and he kept it, reinforcing it even more in the summer that followed. And every time Mr. George passed by and saw the work, he gave Arthur a nod of respect that the other man accepted without ceremony. without needing anything more than that. Life in the small township returned to its usual rhythm, with the same tales told over the fences, the same cups of coffee on cold mornings, the same pine trees on the horizon. But there was something different now, something small, almost imperceptible to those who don't know how to look. It was the way people spoke about Arthur, no longer with that little smirk at the corner of the mouth. Now it was with another kind of respect, the kind that only time and reason can give, the kind that no one needs to declare because everyone already feels it. And on the nights when the wind picked up and the temperature dropped faster than expected, Martha would wrap her coat around herself in the living room, listen to the noise outside and say, almost to herself, "Good thing he's stubborn." Arthur from across the room pretended not to hear, but she knew he had. End of story. This story stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. There's something very beautiful about someone who carries their father's word like a map, even when no one else can see the path. And there's something even more beautiful about a woman who, in the end, recognizes that trusting another person is an act of love just as much as anything else. I keep thinking, how many stories like this are out there, about people who were called crazy, who kept going anyway, and whose time eventually proved them right? And how many will we never know because the person gave up before getting there? I hope that Arthur, who lives inside each of us, whatever the project, the dream, the idea that no one believes in yet, keeps digging. Because the blizzard comes for everyone. The question is what we'll have built by the time it arrives. Tell us where you're watching from and what you thought of this story. Would you have kept digging in Arthur's place, even with everyone doubting you? Leave a comment, we'd love to read it. Thank you so much for your company, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.